What implications does the above have for the Freudian account of suicide? Those that attempt the deed of committing suicide half-heartedly, or in desperation to flee from a life of misery, suffering and pain, might be doing what they are doing blindly. That is, they may not, in a sense, know exactly what they are doing. They may, unconsciously, be hoping for some care and attention, compassion, or even physical help to stop the process they have begun. All of these alternatives would seem to be covered by the description, committed suicide whilst the balance of the mind was disturbed. We can also, in normal circumstances, engage in actions blindly. There are many issues at play here, but given the fact that this is a legal verdict, and as such, rests upon an adequate understanding of the psychological factors involved, we can accept such a description as accurate, and to be clearly distinguished from a verdict of death by misadventure, where the victim is trying to climb a cliff without adequate knowledge of climbing techniques. Anyway, in a possible Freudian account of the act, reference would be made to the wounding of a weak ego by trauma or loss, such that the suffering involved overwhelms the operation of the reality principle, and a cruel superego filled with the emotion of hate is ruled by the death instinct which, instead of unleashing aggression outward, paranoically, turns the aggression inward. There are many psychological mechanisms involved in such a state of affairs, and Freud can account for most of them. The expression balance of the mind, therefore, is one which also indicates that the victim was not freely acting, but instead was a victim of a number of causal mechanisms which blinded him to reality. Campbell, in this essay, also points to the influence of mythology and religion upon past generations, who found themselves in circumstances different to ours, and were perhaps not as free as we are. Such individuals, perhaps, did not have the knowledge of Sush that we possess now. This period that Campbell speaks about was not as long ago as one might imagine. Even during the time of Socrates, we still find the philosopher sacrificing a cock in gratitude for a painless administration of poison. Animal life was not respected as much as it is today by the man in the street. Recall Pythagoras's account of experiencing someone in the street kicking a dog, and his reprimand that animals have souls too. They too, for him, were sush, forms of life. One does not have to go too far back in time to encounter the practice of human sacrifice to the gods, indicating a lack of care for even the human form of life. Did these primitive civilizations not then feel what we feel and flinch at using the life principle to take a life? Campbell argues that such sacrificial rituals might have inherited an attitude toward life from Mother Earth religions where the first fact of life is that life consumes life, eats life, and the image of the Ourobaric serpent biting its own tail is a representation of this mystery. But another mystery of the serpent is indicated when it sheds its skin and is born again. So that along with the idea of death as the precondition of life comes this other idea of an involved power in life within this phenomenal field of time and space which puts on bodies and puts them off, as we read in the Bhagavad Gita, as a man puts off and puts on clothing. The image of the serpent being born again when he has not died, but only shed his skin is somewhat strained if it is to serve as an argument for a life form taking the same body after it has died. Only the skin has died. The snake's body remains alive and the same. A better image would be an image of the actual death of the snake in the vicinity of its reproduced offspring. Even this image only records the comings and goings of life as such. There is no image of, or argument for, an afterlife in these remarks. Such a religion also suggests the possibility of the phenomenal realm opening out into a timeless realm of the noumenal or supersensible. It leaves understanding of this timeless zone to those subtle and superior intellects who can, for example, see what is happening in dreams, and understand their latent meaning. As human life transformed itself from a nomadic form of existence to the earliest form of the city-states, we find, for example, in Mesopotamia, Uruk, Logesh, Nippur, Shuruppak, etc., that the organization of the city introduced initially a hierarchy of professional functions, e.g. priests, with superior subtle intellects, politicians, traders, farmers, warriors, etc. It was no accident that it was during this phase of man's history that writing and mathematics emerged to assist in the process of the organization of the city-states. We also encounter the phenomenon of stargazing and the noticing of the ever so slightly changing positions of the constellations in the sky. Observing and measuring what was observed appeared to be a favorite pastime of some of the occupants of the city. This activity eventually generated a mathematical tool based on the number 60, capable of measuring circular motions. Buddha argued also around this time in the East that the ego was witnessing, whatever this meant exactly, one's thoughts, feelings, and the activities of the body. This ego, according to Buddha, could not directly be witnessed, and lay, as Wittgenstein claimed in his early work, at the boundary of the world, and not in the world like the heavenly constellations. This transcendental ego, it was suggested, lay in a supersensible realm, but there was no God in the normal sense of the word. Other religions suggested other conceptions of gods, but the Western tradition probably began with Zoroastrianism, which expressed itself in the philosophy of Heraclitus, and in favor of a dialectical field of opposites that saw opposites to be separated without any possible category of unification, e.g. light and dark, good and evil. In our Western tradition also, the deities were many, usually instantiating different kinds of power and possessing different names. Some deities were associated with good, and some with evil and the devil, which possessed the power to possess good souls and make them do evil things. The Bible, for example, contains the record of the struggle between such deities, e.g. biblical kings sacrificing to more primitive nature gods. The Greeks mitigated this Heraclitean dialectical play of opposition forces by trying to domesticate the more evil forces such as Poseidon with his trident ruling the underwater world, by, that is, allowing him to live in divine and sacred spaces. At the same time as men were recording the motions of the constellations in the heavens, there were Greek figures like Anaxagoras, who suddenly claimed that this sacred space of the heavens was inhabited by materialistically characterized planets and stars. He claimed further that the moon was made of the same kind of material as the earth, the sun was made of red-hot metal, and the other stars were fiery rocks. Source AI Summary and Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. This view probably contributed to his expulsion from Athens on religious grounds. The light of the moon was, as a consequence of this picture, claimed to be the reflected light of the sun, and he was the first to correctly explain how eclipses occur. This was one of the first excursions of science into the sacred space of religion and mythology. Anaxagoras, we also know, was in Athens at the time of Socrates, and his work could be bought for 1 drachma. He was not, as some claim, a pure materialist, because he claimed that the intellectual force of Noos produced order in the universe. Euripides interpreted this to mean that Noos was inside of all ensouled entities, including humans. Noos produced order within us too. Anaxagoras was instrumental in influencing Socrates to abandon his earlier materialistic physical investigations and begin looking, both for a method of explanation and the philosophical explanation for Noos. Plato, too, is actually ambiguous in his mythology, both claiming that mathematics was very important knowledge for the building of the ideal city-state, but at the same time using an allegorical argument for the form of the good, which was related to Noos, namely the role of the sun in everyone's lives. As we mentioned earlier, Plato in his Republic was also fascinated by what he called this magic number of 432,000, the time it took for the constellations of the zodiac to rotate back to the same position. In his dialogues about Socrates, Plato emphasized the wisdom of his teacher, as demonstrated by his use of elenchus in the Agora in relation to those experts on various subjects who thought they knew what they clearly did not. These dialogues were one of the first competitors to mythology, and the allegories contained therein. Argument, rather than allegory, was the tool of the philosophers that came after Plato, especially Aristotle, who more or less invented both logic and biology as areas of study. Something being like something else was a mere rhetorical device, insofar as Aristotle was concerned. The Delphic challenge to know thyself also became an important concern for Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who all sought in their various ways to formulate a theory of the human form of Sush. Aristotle was perhaps the most successful in this quest, arriving as he did at the essence-specifying definition: rational animal capable of discourse, a definition related to both his knowledge in biology and his use of logic. The definition does not proclaim that all men are actually rational, only that this is the highest potential for man, if he is fortunate enough to develop a subtle and superior intellect. Kant would later elaborate upon Aristotle's hylomorphism, and whilst the argumentative principles of non-contradiction and sufficient reason were an important part of his methodology, what he said about being and its many meanings, and sush, allows mythology a place in his conceptual framework. The Greek contribution to synthesizing Western and Eastern mythological ideas was one seeking harmony, rather than opposition, seeking a way to reveal the mysteries of the universe, and the self, in a spirit of logos and aletheia, which respected the infinite complexity of being and the finitude of human knowledge. The Greek view of science was perhaps best represented by the writings of Aristotle, who certainly used observation and mathematics in those realms that required them, in accordance with his hylomorphic theory, a position that clearly proclaimed that the realms of the supersensible and sacred lay beyond the capacity of the human understanding. Campbell refers to how the spirit of pure observation and measurement, disconnected from their wise use in the three different kinds of sciences constituting the Aristotelian architectonic, transformed very rapidly into a hard concern for hard facts, and he refers to Darwin with the words, "The hero was swept right off the earth." American behaviorism emerged shortly after Darwin's ideas, and very soon after that we find the early Wittgenstein proclaiming in the name of science that the world is the totality of facts. This form of logical atomism favored a dividing up of the life world into stimuli and responses, a world in which it was claimed either that consciousness did not exist, or at best, was not relevant to psychological investigation, which must concern itself only with what can be observed and measured. This also laid the foundations for the equation of the psychology of man with a theory of machine functioning. This state of affairs coincided with Arendt's reflections upon what was occurring in Europe soon after the publication of Darwin's ideas. European political parties were losing their authority, and this created a space for uneducated charlatans and madmen, in which they could claim power and shape the world according to their twisted conceptions of good and evil, conceptions which denied the values embodied in our inherited traditions and educational systems. Whether this can be described as sweeping heroes off the map of the world is questionable, because our earlier thinkers found themselves in an environment where they were constantly responding to the demands for the justification of what was being done, and this is not the context for heroes. Campbell claimed that when these heroes were swept away, the world was devoid of live and positive transformative power. In Campbell's eyes, the two policemen saving the man from attempting to end his life were certainly heroes, in such dramatic circumstances. Lives, however, are also changed and saved by discourse and the use of rationality, in everyday less dramatic circumstances. Campbell argued, too, that the resultant state of affairs favored a re-emergence of what he called the immanence of the occult. If one cannot save the world with knowledge and reason, then perhaps all that remains is magic. During the early 1900s, two giants of psychology, Freud and Jung, emerged in different parts of Europe to challenge behaviorism and the philosophy of logical positivism lying behind it, and these two figures had very different relations to the occult. Carl Jung, for Campbell, may perhaps have been a heroic figure. This is indeed an interesting comparison because, as we know, the first time that these two figures met, they apparently talked uninterruptedly for 13 hours about psychological and philosophical issues. Freud, the founder and leader of an international psychoanalytic movement that had spread rapidly around the world, in fact later, appointed Jung as its president. Soon after this, however, there was a falling out, and the issue that separated these two men was the issue of the role of the occult in psychological theory. Should it be regarded as an actual phenomenon, indicating the presence of a spirit world, or was it rather, as Freud thought, a phenomenon which demanded explanations either in terms of illusory sensory stimuli, or in more complex cases, a product of unbalanced minds? This was a particularly interesting conflict, because both figures claimed to be influenced by Kant. Kant, as we know, wrote an essay entitled Dreams of a Spirit Seer, in which he made it clear that critical philosophy, whilst acknowledging the realm of the noumenal or supersensible, cannot validate the descriptions of events that spirit seers give us. Using a form of elenchus and rational argumentation, Kant does not question that men may think they see, and hear, spirits from another realm of existence, but these phenomena permit of alternative descriptions and explanation, which are more in accord with what it is possible for us to know, as outlined in Kant's critical philosophy. The mystery of the supersensible realm, argues Kant, must be carefully explored using what we know about the nature of the world and the nature of our minds. Mysticism, he argues, does not possess the conceptual framework or authority necessary to give us a reliable and valid account of mysterious phenomena. Freud, of course, was put in a difficult position when Jung's interest in paranormal phenomena became known to him, and he wrote thus in one of his letters to Jung in 1911. I am aware that you are driven with innermost inclination to the study of the occult, and I am sure you will return home richly laden. I cannot argue with that. It is always right to go where your impulses lead. You will be accused of mysticism, but the reputation you won with dementia will hold up for quite some time against that. Just don't stay in the tropical colonies too long. You must remain at home. May 12, 1911. It is clear that the Freudian theorizing on the nature of Sush includes a reference to the idea of a supersensible realm, but we should recall in this context that the project Kant was engaged upon involved creating a new sense of the metaphysical that was not mystical, but allowed a logical space for the great truths of mythology to persist with philosophical support, and in accordance with a tradition of rationalism stretching back to Plato and Aristotle. Seances and a belief in a spiritual afterlife is inconsistent with this tradition, and its understanding of the scope and limits of the basic term Sush, which itself contains reference to the transcendental and metaphysical in its human form. On such an account, the concept of the afterlife may, at best, be metaphorical, and at worst, an example of what Freud referred to as projection, a defense designed to reduce anxiety or fulfill a fantasy-laden wish. The above letter was written before Freud's later wave of theorizing, which was more rooted in the ideas of Plato, Aristotle, and Kant. So it is possible that Freud's earlier responses to Jung's mysticism was not as diplomatic as the written response. Freud was familiar with the work of Kant, and would have read Dreams of a Spirit Seer, Kant's criticism of the mystic Swedenborg. Metaphysical spiritualism was certainly one of the targets of Kant's critical philosophy, as was hylozoism, and materialism of various forms. Both Jung's collective unconscious and Freud's unconscious were skeptical of the prevailing psychology of consciousness, which was attempting to confront head-on the materialism of behaviorism. Freud, we ought to recall in this context, was a reductionist, a committed neuroscientific materialist, when he wrote the work Project for a Scientific Psychology. In this work, which he later burned, for fear of tarnishing his reputation, he postulated three types of neuron, and the energy regulation and pleasure-pain principles which he would later retain in a larger framework of ideas. Jung does, in his psychology, attempt to use certain Kantian terms such as intuition and thought, but his concern was not to provide an essence-specifying definition of human Sush, but rather to map the differences in personality between people. For Jung, personality was mostly conceived to be determined by inherited predispositions to be found in the collective unconscious of mankind. These dispositions determined both the behavior and thought of man. Jung also referred to two attitudes, extroversion and introversion, and two kinds of states concerned with one's balance of mind, namely stability and neuroticism, as well as four psychological functions, sensing, feeling, intuition, and thinking. These latter functions were then used to determine 16 psychological personality types. This is an impressive framework dedicated to the mapping of differences between men, and to that extent one may feel that Jung's work has made a contribution to the discipline of psychology. To some extent, his work complements the work of Freud. Yet at the same time, it must be noted that there is a major difference between these two psychologists, insofar as the importance of religion is concerned. Freud must be regarded as concerned with criticizing primarily Western religion, and Jung perhaps promoted archetypes of many world religions. Lawrence van der Post's book, Jung and the Story of Our Time, London, Penguin, 1976. This ancient Greek world seemed a more naturally religious world than the Christian world in which the Reformation was about to explode. Even at the greatest period of Greek history and its point of loftiest achievement in arts, science, philosophy, politics, and affairs of religion, the gods themselves did not hesitate to come down from Olympus and participate in some shape, in the heat and dust of the battle, to live out the meaning that invested life on earth. Indeed, the fact that the gods themselves were housed in their native Olympus seemed to be significant proof of the close and intimate connection of Greece with its religious experiences. It was also significant that Greece's decline started with the relegation of its gods to the planets and outer space. Page 31. It is clear from Van der Post's account that the ancient Greeks lived in a religious space and time, and everyone during the day in the agora, or dreaming in their homes during the night, were in some sense in the company of their gods. He also notes that the period of the Renaissance was a period in which an attempt was made to revive this passion for living by using all the powers at the disposal of one's personality. He expressed admiration for the Elizabethan Renaissance and its primary spokesman Shakespeare, whom he claimed possessed an unparalleled gift for expression. Page 33. This extrovert spirit of the time, however, was soon to turn to its negation in introversion, and seek to remedy the diminishing role of religion by a psychological mechanism which projected its aggression outward, thus creating the ideal atmosphere for wars that became increasingly barbaric as the technology for the instigation of death became more and more lethal. In this context, it is worthwhile recording that Descartes, one of the new men, was a mercenary in the 30-Year War, and also a designer of war machines. We should also point out that it was to Freud that Einstein, commissioned by the League of Nations, turned for a psychological analysis of war in 1933. Freud, by this time, would have been able not to just list the psychological conditions necessary for the rise of mad tyrants and their success in persuading the masses to sanction their mad violent projects, but also refer to the kind of psychological effects that wars have upon their participants. Amongst these conditions, however, Freud did not refer to the after effects of the ongoing process of secularization and the collapse of the authority of religion. Revolutions can be at least as brutal as war, and Van der Post has no doubt that the French Revolution was associated with the deposing of religion and the crowning of reason amidst the atrocities committed. After all, one cannot overlook the symbolic importance of the fact that when the French Revolution was perpetrating its greatest inhumanities against helpless men and women, it officially deposed God and in his place actually crowned a goddess of reason in Notre Dame in Paris. Page 37. Rousseau is the enigmatic counter-Enlightenment figure that stands opposed, both to the authority of religion and reason. We should recall, however, that Rousseau played an important part in Kant's enlightened critical philosophy by convincing Kant to abandon his Wolffian rationalism and adopt a more nuanced approach, which took into account the dignity of man. In his work on Emile, which Kant avidly read, we find a pupil who does not read the Bible, but Robinson Crusoe, and we also find Rousseau affectionately embracing his fictional ideal pupil and leaving his own children to an orphanage. Van der Post points to Rousseau's claim that civilization is no longer progressing, and also to the fact that Rousseau's philosophizing does little to mitigate the suffering soul of modern man. He attributes much to the inefficacy of religion to affect the spirit of man positively.